They told everyone I was dead, not metaphorically, not emotionally. Literally dead. According to my husband's lawyer, a man I'd never even met, I'd passed away in a tragic accident 5 months ago. The first time I heard this lie, I was standing barefoot in my garage, holding a box of Christmas lights and staring at the certified letter like it had crawled out of hell. The letter wasn't addressed to me, of course not. It was addressed to Madeline Carter, deceased, with a copy sent to my husband's brother, the executor of my mother-in-law's estate. I wasn't even supposed to be alive, that's how it started. I'll rewind. My name is Madeline Carter. 42, single mom, former Army medic turned home care nurse. I've lived in the same house in Oregon for 11 years. I have one daughter, Emily, and up until this year, I was married to Daniel Carter, a charming, camera-ready small-town lawyer who never raised his voice and never missed a chance to make me feel invisible. Daniel came home one day in January, looked me in the eyes over reheated lasagna, and told me we needed to separate temporarily for emotional clarity. By March, he'd moved into his late mother's vacation cabin in Bend. He said he needed space. I didn't know a space meant draining our joint bank account and rewriting history. When the letter came, claiming I was dead, my hands didn't shake. Not even a little. I stood still for what felt like an hour before I finally whispered to myself, he really did it. Because deep down, some part of me already knew Daniel always played the long game. The good husband. The devoted son. He doted on his mother like she was the Queen of England, even when she told me, straight-faced, that she never really saw me as family. When she passed away in May, I didn't cry. I drove Emily to the wake, brought a lemon cake, and left before anyone could ask me to stay, but now it made sense why Daniel had insisted I sit this one out from the funeral. Why no one in his family had called me since. Why the estate lawyer never returned my messages. Because I had already been erased legally. I went inside and locked the door. Emily was at school. I sat on the cold kitchen floor and stared at the tile. Not crying. Not thinking. Just processing. I wasn't dead. But someone had filed paperwork saying I was. And that someone had access to my mother-in-law's estate, the same estate that Emily and I were entitled to a share of. That night, I pulled every document I had. My birth certificate. Marriage license. My military discharge. Emily's school enrollment forms. I lined them up like a soldier prepping for war. Because if Daniel wanted me dead on paper, I'd make damn sure he regretted burying me alive. At 2 a.m., I opened our fireproof safe, the one Daniel had said he never used, and found something strange, a torn envelope with a postmark from the month his mother died. It was addressed to me, in her handwriting. But it had never been opened. Inside was a single line, "Keep this safe. In case they try anything." No signature. Just that, I didn't sleep that night. Not because I was scared, but because everything I'd been ignoring, every micro-betrayal, every time I'd been dismissed or silenced, it all clicked into place. This wasn't just a divorce, it was a full erasure, and Daniel thought he'd win because I was quiet, practical, invisible. The nurse. The mother. The woman who never asked for more, but I was also a combat veteran, and he had just made me a ghost with a pulse, and a plan. The first thing I did the next morning was call the county clerk's office. I used my calmest voice, the one I used with dying patients and frightened families, and asked if there had been a death certificate filed for a Madeline Carter, date of birth April 14, 1983. The woman on the line said, "One moment, let me check." I could hear her clicking keys, humming softly like this was any other Tuesday, and then she said, "Yes, there's a death certificate on file. Filed May 26, cause of death listed as automobile accident." I almost laughed. I hadn't driven more than 10 miles that entire month. Where was the accident? I asked. Just says, Deschutes County. That was Bend. Where Daniel had moved. Where his mother had died. Who filed it? There was a pause. The submitting party was Daniel Carter, spouse. I wrote that down. My fingers were steady. My heart, though, it felt like it had dropped through my ribs and buried itself in the floor. I thanked her, hung up, and called a friend, Monica, an nurse who'd once sued her ex-husband for hiding assets in a fake landscaping business. She'd given me the name of her lawyer months ago, just in case. I'd laughed back then. Not now. By noon, I was sitting across from Angela Sims, a 50-something legal bulldog in navy slacks and tortoiseshell glasses. Her office smelled like burned coffee and dry ink. She let me talk for 20 straight minutes without interrupting. When I told her about the letter, the fake death certificate, the unopened envelope from my mother-in-law, she leaned back in her chair and said, "This isn't just fraud. It's premeditated estate theft." And then she asked me the question that finally cracked my voice. "What do you want, Madeline?" I could have said justice. I could have said money. But what I said was, "I want them to remember I was never the one to cross." Angela smiled. "Slow and sharp, then we'll start with your resurrection." She filed a motion that afternoon to invalidate the death certificate. She called the estate attorney's office and left a message that made the paralegal audibly gasp. And she told me something I didn't know: if there was a will filed without you being properly notified as a surviving spouse, it can be contested. If there's evidence of forgery or fraud, even better. But if there's another will? A real one? That's the bomb. That night, after Emily went to bed, I pulled out the envelope again. Keep this safe. In case they try anything. What had she meant? Daniel's mother had been cold to me, but she wasn't stupid. She'd been a real estate broker for 30 years. She knew how her sons operated, especially Daniel. I went into the attic. We rarely used it, too dusty, too hot. But something in my gut told me she wouldn't leave anything obvious. Not in a safe. Not in a drawer. She'd leave it somewhere. Daniel wouldn't bother to look. The attic was packed with old baby clothes, camping gear, boxes of tax documents. And in the corner, beneath a moth-eaten quilt from Daniel's college years, was a cedar chest. I cracked it open. It smelled like old perfume and regret, and there, beneath some yellowed letters and a porcelain angel I recognized from my mother-in-law's dresser, was a legal envelope marked, "Last Will and Testament, Elaine Carter, May 2024. Not June." Not the month Daniel had submitted the one to probate court. I opened it with trembling fingers, and my name was there. Emily's too. Specific bequests. A paragraph about protecting my granddaughter's future regardless of marital breakdowns. And then this line: "I have excluded Daniel Carter from primary inheritance due to his prior misuse of family funds. This decision is final." I sat back and exhaled, long and slow. There it was, the original will, the one Daniel had buried, literally and figuratively, the one he tried to override with a forged version after declaring me dead, and suddenly I knew what came next: not rage, not confrontation, but strategy. Let him think I was still invisible, let him walk into court with his polished smile and fraudulent documents, let them all sit in that room, ready to discuss a woman they thought was buried and gone, and then I'd walk in alive. Armed. And holding the truth in my hands. Angela's expression didn't change when I handed her the will, not at first. She read in silence, flipping each page with the same clinical precision I'd seen in surgeons prepping for trauma surgery. But by page 4, she looked up at me and said, "This changes everything." The original will was airtight. Witnessed. Notarized. Dated a full month before the forged one Daniel had submitted. And unlike Daniel's version, this one had me, Madeline Carter, living spouse, listed in clear, unambiguous language. Our daughter, Emily, was given a trust account to be managed by a third-party fiduciary. And most damning of all, Daniel was disinherited. Angela stood and locked the door to her office. "We're filing for an emergency motion to halt all estate disbursements," she said. "Tomorrow morning. First thing." My head was spinning, but it was a clean spin, no fog, no panic. Just sharp, clear movement. Like I'd stepped into a version of myself I hadn't accessed in years. "I want to be in the room when it happens," I said. Angela looked at me for a long moment. "You sure? It's going to get ugly." I'm counting on it. What followed was a blur of legal filings, affidavit signatures, and aggressive paralegal phone calls. Angela moved like a machine, pulling court dates, notifying the probate judge, and requesting a temporary injunction on any distribution of Elaine Carter's estate. Every time I thought I understood the depth of Daniel's betrayal, another layer fell off. He hadn't just forged a new will. He'd built a whole fake narrative. Filed documents, coached his brother through a grieving son, hacked, and even notified Elaine's financial advisor that I was no longer with us. The bank had closed out my access. Her lawyer had archived me. Her friends believed I'd moved away. It was an elegant erasure, and it had almost worked until that single sentence in her letter, "Keep this safe, in case they try anything." Angela submitted a formal fraud report to the Bar Association. She explained the full sequence of lies, and we requested subpoena power for Daniel's emails and financial records. "You think he'll crack?" I asked her. She smiled, not kindly. "He won't have to. The paper trail will do it for him." That night, after Emily fell asleep beside me watching Frozen for the 100th time, I sat in the living room in the dark. No lights. Just the low hum of the fridge, the ticking of the wall clock, and the weight of silence. I thought about the years I spent shrinking myself, keeping the house running while Daniel played the role of the generous husband. Saying thank you when his family gave me backhanded compliments. Laughing at jokes that made me small. Apologizing for asking questions. How many times had I told myself, it's not worth the fight? Now I knew why they'd underestimated me. Because I let them. The next morning, Angela called me at 6:42 a.m. "Probate judge agreed to see us in chambers this Friday." "That's fast," I said. "A fraud moves the needle." "And death fraud? That gets attention." She paused, her tone softening slightly. "Daniel doesn't know you're coming. We're not required to notify him, not for the emergency motion." "You still want to do this in person?" I stood in front of the mirror, staring at the woman reflected there, barefaced, no makeup, hair tied back, eyes sharper than they'd been in years. "I want him to see a ghost." The rest of the week passed in quiet preparation. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't warn his brother. I didn't whisper a word to anyone from his circle. Let them think I was still gone, let them practice their fake grief, their polished lies, let them believe they'd gotten away with it, because when I walked into that courtroom on Friday morning, I wasn't just there for a legal proceeding. I was there to return from the dead, and I wasn't leaving without setting the record, and the will, straight. The courtroom was small, not the grand, echoing kind you see on television. It felt more like a conference room dressed in oak, with a single flag in the corner and water-stained carpet that had seen too many shoes and too few repairs. But it was perfect. Because I didn't need drama. I needed impact. Angela walked ahead of me, crisp navy blazer pressed to perfection, her heels tapping out a rhythm of intent. I followed behind in silence, wearing a simple black dress, not mourning, not flashy, just clean. Professional. Alive. The clerk barely looked at me when I entered. No double take. No question. That was good. Daniel hadn't gotten far enough to file a missing persons report. He'd done just enough to remove me from the estate process, not enough to invite federal heat. He played the line like a surgeon, but I wasn't here to play. I was here to cut clean through. We took our seats across from Franklin Carter, Daniel's older brother and the named executor of Elaine's estate. He looked tired. Too tan, like someone who had taken a vacation he hadn't earned. His lawyer, a younger man with bad posture and a too-wide tie, shuffled papers as we entered. "Still no Daniel?" Angela leaned in. "He's not coming." "Coward." "Strategist." "He's letting Franklin handle it to keep his hands clean." I nodded once. That was Daniel. Always 2 layers removed from the filth he created. The judge entered. Mid-60s. Sharp eyes, white hair. Judge Keller. I'd looked him up. Reputation for zero tolerance on estate fraud. A former JAG Perfect, Angela opened strong, Your Honor, we're requesting an immediate stay on all estate disbursements regarding the late Elaine Carter due to the emergence of a superseding original will and potential fraudulent documentation. Submitted to this court under the presumption that my client, the decedent's daughter-in-law and named beneficiary, was deceased. Franklin's lawyer fumbled, scrambling for his copy of the motion. The judge raised one brow. I was not made aware of any death record for Mrs. Carter. Is she present? Angela looked at me. I stood, Madeline Carter, Your Honor. The room tilted. Not literally, but the silence had a shape to it. Franklin's mouth opened slightly. The lawyer blinked like he was buffering. Judge Keller squinted. You're the deceased? I nodded, calm and deliberate. Apparently. Though I must have missed the memo. Angela slid a certified copy of the fraudulent death certificate across the table. Submitted by Daniel Carter on May 26, 2025. Verified with the county clerk this week. No accident occurred. Mrs. Carter is alive, as evidenced by her presence and legal documentation. We believe this filing was used to bypass her legal standing as spouse and beneficiary under Elaine Carter's last valid will. Then she placed the envelope, the original will, on the table like a loaded gun. This document predates the submitted version by over 4 weeks. It was discovered in the decedent's personal effects and names both Mrs. Carter and her minor daughter as beneficiaries, while specifically excluding Daniel Carter due to prior misconduct. The judge read in silence. He didn't rush. He didn't blink. When he finished, he exhaled through his nose, slow, deliberate. Mr. Russell, he said, turning to Franklin's lawyer, do you have an explanation for this? The poor man looked like he might melt into his chair. Your Honor, I was unaware of a prior will. Mr. Carter of Franklin was under the impression the document filed was the most current. It was provided by Daniel Carter. Angela's voice was calm but lethal. So your client submitted a document without verifying its origin? I trusted Daniel. Judge Keller cut in, sharp and final, mistake number 1. He turned back to Angela. I'm granting your motion for an immediate injunction. No funds or assets are to be moved until this matter is resolved. Furthermore, I'm opening a fraud investigation into the filing of this death certificate. I suggest you advise your client, Daniel Carter, to appear before this court voluntarily. Angela nodded. We'll make sure he's properly notified. As we stood to leave, Franklin finally spoke. You don't understand what you've started. I turned to face him. I didn't start anything, I said, voice low. But I'm damn sure going to finish it. We left the courtroom, not victorious, not yet, but visible alive, and that, for now, was enough. The next day, Daniel called me. I let it ring twice before answering. I wanted him to feel the anticipation. I wanted him to think, just for a second, that maybe I wouldn't pick up, that maybe I was still a ghost. Madeline, he said, too casual, too slow, like we were old friends catching up after coffee. Daniel. My voice was colder than the air in that courtroom. I heard you made quite the appearance yesterday, he said, a little chuckle under his breath. That was dramatic. You declared me dead. That's a bit of an exaggeration. I have the certificate in my hands. He went quiet, and I realized then, it wasn't regret in the silence. It was calculation. He was working an angle. Even now, look, he finally said. There's no need to make this uglier than it already is. You found the old will. Fine. But dragging this out in court, you really want Emily to go through that? There it was. The pivot to guilt. The veiled threat through our daughter. Classic Daniel, you've already put her through worse, I said. Come on, Mads, he said, dropping into that old nickname like it still meant something. Let's be adults. We can reach a settlement. Quietly. I'll make sure you and Emily are taken care of. I smiled, though he couldn't see it. Because I knew something he didn't. Angela had already submitted a request to subpoena Daniel's financials. His personal and business accounts. If he agreed to a quiet settlement now, it would be a pre-admission of guilt, and that would make our civil fraud case bulletproof. I'm not looking to be taken care of, I said. I'm looking to restore what you tried to erase. A pause. So this is war now? I didn't answer. I just ended the call. Angela's team moved fast. By the following Monday, we had court-approved access to Daniel's bank records. The findings were worse than expected: multiple transfers to offshore accounts, large cash withdrawals days before Elaine's funeral, and a suspicious payment to a consulting firm that didn't exist beyond a P.O. box in Nevada. Fraud, concealment, conspiracy. Angela called it a gold mine, and Daniel's smart, she said, but he's not thorough. He thought no one would question the paperwork if the narrative was airtight. Dead wife. Grieving son. Loyal executor brother. Too clean to poke holes in. But ghosts have nothing to lose, and I was about to haunt him in every room he thought was locked up. We filed formal fraud charges in probate court. Angela added a civil suit for damages. And we submitted a complaint to the State Bar Association. If the investigation found Daniel had knowingly participated in will forgery and death certificate fraud, he could lose his license to practice law. When I told Monica, she laughed out loud. Girl, she said, you're not just taking back what's yours. You're about to strip him bare. But this wasn't about revenge, not really. It was about truth. About unerasing myself. About making sure that Emily never had to wonder why her mother's name disappeared from every family photo, every financial document, every story told by the people who claimed to love us. Daniel thought I would disappear quietly. Instead, I became undeniable. Angela prepared me for the next hearing, the one where Daniel would have to appear in person. He'll charm, she warned. He'll deflect. He'll try to pivot to emotion. Stick to the facts. Let the documents speak. Don't let him make you the unstable ex. That's the game. I nodded, but I already knew how to win, because I wasn't going in as his ex-wife. I was going in as the woman who came back from the dead with the receipts and ghosts. They don't flinch. Court was set for 9 a.m. on Thursday. By 8:35, I was in my seat. Black pantsuit. No jewelry. Clean hair pulled into a low bun. Angela had told me once, neutrality is your weapon. You walk in looking like a fact, not a feeling. So that's what I did. Daniel walked in at 8:47. I hadn't seen him in person for 6 months, but he looked exactly the same: pressed shirt, polished shoes, that same effortless calm he used to disarm everyone. He scanned the room and froze when he saw me. Just for a breath. Just enough. Then the mask returned. He leaned into his lawyer, whispering something while I stared straight ahead. I didn't flinch. Didn't blink. I wasn't here to react. I was here to watch the collapse. Angela opened. She always did. Your Honor, our client seeks recognition of the original will signed by Elaine Carter, dated May 2, 2024, as the final and binding legal document, and requests the court invalidate the subsequent will submitted on June 12 due to evidence of forgery and financial motive. She slid exhibits across the desk: the handwriting analysis, the notary log from the May will, a forensic report on the ink used in the June version. Different pens. Different paper stock. No notary on record. Then she brought out the death certificate filed by Daniel Carter, declaring his wife deceased as of May 26, while she was alive and residing at her home in Clatsop County. No accident. No incident. No police report. Nothing to justify this declaration. And no legal divorce at the time. She paused. Looked toward the bench. This filing was not a mistake, Your Honor. It was a tactic. Daniel's lawyer finally stood. He was smoother than Franklin's, but not by much. My client acknowledges the original will, and, regrettably, confirms there may have been confusion regarding the order of documents at the time of submission. As for the death certificate, Mr. Carter had received second-hand information that led him to believe his wife had passed. Angela rose before the judge could respond. No obituary. No hospital records. No confirmation of death. Just hearsay from a man who stood to benefit from her legal absence. That's not confusion. That's calculated fraud. The judge, a different one this time, Judge Martinez, held up both wills side by side. Mr. Carter, she said, did you file this second will knowing your wife was still alive? Daniel didn't look at me. He said, I believed she had moved. That she didn't want to be involved in any of this. Not what I asked. He hesitated, I wasn't sure. He finally said, Angela didn't even need to speak. The silence filled the room like water rising. The judge nodded slowly. We will continue the fraud inquiry separately. For today's purposes, the original will is hereby recognized as valid and binding. All distributions under the June document are suspended indefinitely. Further proceedings will determine the extent of any fraudulent activity. Daniel's face stayed still, too still. Angela leaned over and whispered, he's calculating again. He's going to make a move before the next hearing. I knew exactly what that meant. That night, my phone buzzed with a call from a blocked number. I didn't answer. Then came the text, we can still fix this, Mads. Think of Emily. No signature. No context. Just desperation in a 6-word sentence. I deleted it, then I changed my locks. Daniel had tried to remove me with paperwork, now I would remove him with proof. Angela sent me a secured link to Daniel's bank records. We were building the case for civil fraud, and if we could link his offshore transfers to the missing funds from Elaine's accounts, we'd have enough to bury him financially, not just professionally. I stayed up until 3 a.m. going through the documents. $14,000 withdrawn the day after Elaine's death, $6,800 wired to something labeled Sunlight Holdings. Receipts for staged expenses, hospice care that never happened. Legal fees billed for documents that didn't exist, but one entry froze me, $2,000 to Rogue River Mortuary, dated the same day as my death certificate filing. That he paid for a fake record. That he paid someone to make me legally disappear, and that was the nail. Angela didn't speak for a full 30 seconds after I showed her the mortuary record, then she leaned back, exhaled through her nose, and said, he actually paid someone to file a fraudulent death certificate. That's not just civil fraud anymore. That's a felony. We were sitting in her office, blinds closed, papers spread across the conference table like puzzle pieces. My hands were steady as I handed her the printout. It showed the transaction in plain black ink. Rogue River Mortuary Services, $2,000, May 26. There was no obituary. No cremation service. No transportation of remains. Just the name of a business Daniel had never mentioned, and a payment on the exact day I was declared legally dead. Angela called in her assistant and handed over the lead. I want every detail on that mortuary, owners, filings, past clients, affiliations. If they took that money and filed fake paperwork, they're part of the fraud ring. I stayed silent. But inside, I was burning cold. Daniel hadn't made a mistake. He had orchestrated the entire thing with surgical precision. He hadn't just buried a will, he tried to bury me. Not with a weapon. With documents. Paper cuts that could kill slowly, and if the court hadn't believed me, I would have been erased. Over the next few days, we built the skeleton of the full civil suit: fraud, emotional damages, obstruction of inheritance, and falsification of legal records. We even added identity theft, but then something unexpected happened. Daniel's brother, Franklin, called me and I almost didn't answer. But I was curious. He'd been complicit, but unlike Daniel, Franklin had looked genuinely stunned in court. His voice was cautious. Not apologetic, but not hostile either. Madeline, look, I didn't know the will was fake. I said nothing. He sighed. Daniel told me she updated it right before she died. I never saw the old one. He brought the copy and had it notarized. Before I even got involved. Did you ever ask why I wasn't listed? I asked. I assumed you were out of the picture. Dead. He paused. He said you left. Took Emily. Said you didn't want anything. I laughed, but it wasn't humor. He said I was dead. You signed off on a death certificate. I didn't see the death certificate, he said quickly. He handled that. He said he was taking care of the formalities. Silence. Then, look, I'm sorry. I didn't know it went that far. But I don't want to go down for this. I didn't forge anything. Then give me something, I said. Give me a thread to pull. He hesitated. He has a safe in the cabin. Behind the bookshelf. He keeps backups. Contracts. Paperwork. Maybe even notes. My stomach tightened. And you're just telling me this now? I didn't know what I was part of until that courtroom, Madeline. I swear. But I have a kid too. I'm not letting Daniel take me down with him. I hung up and called Angela immediately. She had already anticipated this. If we get a subpoena for that cabin, and if we find duplicate documents or signs of forgery, we won't just have leverage, we'll have criminal intent. The next day, we filed for a court-ordered search of the Carter family cabin in Bend, Oregon. It took less than 48 hours to get approval. The judge moved fast. Too much smoke, they were expecting fire. Angela brought a forensic document examiner and a paralegal to catalog everything. I needed to see it. The cabin was exactly how I remembered it, rustic, cold, silent. The same place Daniel had retreated to when Elaine died. The place he'd used as his planning bunker while I was sitting in our house, wondering where it all went wrong. Angela directed the investigator to the bookshelf. Within 10 minutes, the safe was open. Inside were folders neatly labeled Estate Strategy, June, Revised Will, Draft, Madeline Docs, Alt. That last one stopped me. Angela pulled it slowly. Her fingers moved like she was diffusing a bomb. Inside, a photocopy of the death certificate. Two versions of Elaine's will, one matching the original, and one matching the fake, and, buried in the back, a handwritten note in Daniel's angular cursive. Make sure Franklin signs the final version. Say it's just a formatting update. Keep the May 1 hidden, attic maybe? Don't destroy it yet. Just in case. My jaw locked. Angela held it up, stone-faced. We've got him. In his own handwriting. She handed it to me, and I read it again. Attic maybe? He'd guessed that he'd known Elaine might leave something for me, and he'd gambled I'd never find it. He was wrong. By the time we left the cabin, the sun had already dropped behind the trees, casting long shadows over the frozen gravel drive. I stood at the edge of the porch, holding that note, rereading the words over and over again. Don't destroy it yet. Just in case. He'd come so close. If I hadn't gone into that attic, if I tossed the envelope Elaine had left me without opening it, if I believed for 1 second that Daniel's silence was just part of the separation, he would have erased me legally. Financially. Entirely. Angela's voice broke through my thoughts. We've got more than enough now. His handwriting. The drafts. The intent. This isn't just fraud anymore, it's premeditated estate theft. With documented conspiracy. She looked at me squarely. We go public with this next. I nodded, slowly. Until now, everything had stayed quiet, deliberate, surgical, confined to courtrooms and email chains. But now it was time to pull back the curtain. Because Daniel still had influence. Still had friends in the legal community. Still had a story that we were going to rewrite that story with facts. Angela drafted a formal press release for the State Bar Ethics Review Board, outlining Daniel's involvement in falsifying court documents, filing a fraudulent death certificate, and manipulating inheritance records to remove his wife and daughter from a legally binding will. The same report was shared with the Oregonian and 3 local legal publications. Daniel had always played clean in public, the upstanding lawyer, the community sponsor, the man who donated to the church every Christmas. But paper doesn't lie. 2 days later, my phone lit up with messages, some supportive, some stunned, a few venomous, but one message stopped me cold. It was from a woman named Claire. I believe you. He did the same thing to me. Let me know if you need a statement. I called her. Claire had been Daniel's client 3 years ago. She was going through a bitter divorce with a man who owned multiple rental properties. Daniel had represented her until, she said, her ex mysteriously produced a prenuptial agreement she'd never seen before. One she swore wasn't real. She didn't have the money to fight it, and Daniel had walked away clean. Angela interviewed her that night. Claire was cautious, but steady. She had records of Daniel's emails, texts that showed pressure, contradictions in the timeline. She'd never put the pieces together, never thought he might have fabricated the prenup. I thought I was just naive, she said quietly. Turns out, I was just too trusting. When she sent over the emails, one line chilled me. Daniel, writing to Claire, sometimes people just disappear, Claire. Legally. It happens all the time. Angela forwarded that to the state investigators. We were no longer talking about one woman's inheritance. We were building a pattern. Daniel called me again. I didn't answer. He texted, "You're blowing this up for what? Ego?" Then again, "Don't do this, Madeline. Don't be cruel." Cruel, the man who had buried my name and bought my death certificate, now accused me of cruelty because I refused to stay quiet. I didn't reply. But I kept every message. Every word. They would come in handy. That Friday, Angela filed the formal civil complaint for damages, totaling $385,000 in direct inheritance losses, emotional distress, legal costs, and punitive damages. But the number wasn't the point. The point was exposure. We requested a public hearing. I sat in the gallery, watching Daniel's expression as he read the complaint for the first time. It was the first time I'd seen him look small. Angela stood before the judge and read our case out loud, in front of media, in front of Daniel's peers, in front of court staff who had once passed him in hallways with smiles, and when she reached the part about the handwritten note, the entire courtroom shifted, because words matter, and his were going to destroy him. After the hearing, I sat in my car for a long time, hands resting on the wheel, engine off. The world outside moved in slow motion, pedestrians shuffling past. A city bus coughing exhaust into the sky, someone laughing across the street as if nothing monumental had just happened inside that courthouse, but something had, because for the first time, Daniel didn't look like the man who always won. Not he looked exposed. Angela joined me in the parking garage, slipping into the passenger seat without a word. She didn't speak for a full minute, just tapped her phone screen with a quiet focus. Finally, she looked at me. "You did well in there." I didn't say a word. I replied, "That was the point. Let them speak your truth for you. That's power." We drove in silence until we reached the edge of town. I dropped her off at her office, and then drove past my old gym, the coffee shop Daniel used to take his secret meetings in, the hardware store where we'd once picked out bathroom tiles together, tiles I installed by myself after he left. The city hadn't changed, but I had to. I spent the next week pulling my life into focus. I met with a financial advisor. We built a new budget around Emily's future trust, assuming the original will held, and we secured our portion. I went through every old file, every tax document, every account Daniel might have touched, and then I called the locksmith. I changed every lock in the house, including the garage, the attic, and the backyard shed. I installed cameras. Not because I thought Daniel would try something violent, he wasn't that type. But I didn't put anything past a man who had tried to make me legally vanish. Emily didn't ask questions. She knew something had happened, but I shielded her from the specifics. She just curled into me at night, watching movies and drawing on the couch while I responded to emails and legal briefs. One night, as she colored a picture of a unicorn, she looked up and asked, "Why is Daddy so mad?" I froze. She didn't sound scared, just curious. Like she was putting the world together in pieces, and Daniel's absence didn't quite fit. I knelt down beside her. "Sometimes," I said, "people make choices that hurt others. And they get mad when those choices don't work the way they wanted." She blinked. "Did he make bad choices?" I nodded. "Yes. But we're going to be okay." She went back to coloring. That night, I stared at the ceiling long after she fell asleep. The weight of everything, the silence, the strategy, the constant calculation, it sat heavy on my chest. But I didn't cry. I hadn't cried since the day I found the envelope in the attic. It wasn't grief anymore. It was clarity. Angela called the next morning with an update. The Bar Association had moved quickly after the public hearing. They were opening formal disciplinary proceedings against Daniel. His license was under review. And once our civil suit moved forward, the findings could lead to criminal referral. "He's cornered," she said. "Now we just wait to see if he folds." 2 hours later, I got an email from Daniel's lawyer, subject, proposed settlement discussion. He wanted to settle, the terms were generous, financially. A lump sum, a statement of non-liability, an agreement to walk away with no further public proceedings. Angela read it and tossed the printout across her desk. He's trying to buy silence. Again. I picked up the paper. Stared at it, I thought. Of every moment I'd been told to keep the peace, every time I'd smiled through clenched teeth at family dinners, every whispered dismissal when I voiced suspicion. Every legal line Daniel had crossed without flinching. Decline it, I said. Angela smiled. Good. I wasn't here for money, I was here for truth, and he was going to face every inch of it, in court, in public, and on the record. The formal deposition was scheduled for the following Friday. Daniel would have to sit across from Angela in a conference room, under oath, with a court reporter transcribing every word. It wasn't trial, but it was real, a space where facts mattered. Anne's spin cracked under pressure. I wasn't required to attend, but I did, not to intimidate him. Not even to see him sweat. I went for one reason only, to remind him I existed, in flesh and blood, with breath in my lungs and legal standing in the court system he once believed he could manipulate. When I walked into the room, Daniel's jaw tightened just enough to let me know I still had power. Angela sat across from him, crisp and composed, her hands resting lightly on a yellow legal pad. She didn't posture. She didn't flinch. She asked questions like surgical incisions. Mr. Carter, who instructed you to file the May 26th death certificate for your wife? No one. I believed she had relocated and did not wish to be contacted. Did you attempt to confirm her death through legal or medical means? I assumed. Assumption is not verification. Please answer directly. Daniel shifted in his seat. No, I didn't. Angela held up the receipt for the mortuary payment. This charge was made on the same day you filed the death certificate. What services were rendered? Silence, Mr. Carter? I don't recall. Angela didn't even blink. So you paid $2,000 to a funeral business for services you can't identify, tied to a death you didn't verify, which directly benefited your own financial position under a forged will? Daniel's lawyer leaned forward. We object to the framing of that question. Angela cut him off, calmly. It's on the record, counsel. The court reporter's fingers clicked like a metronome of justice. I sat still. Unmoving. Watching. The unravel of Daniel had always been so good at making lies look reasonable. But the room was stacked with evidence now. He wasn't speaking into silence, he was speaking into a vacuum of trust he could no longer fill. Angela shifted tone after 2 hours. Moved from fraud to motive. You were disinherited in the original will, correct? Daniel hesitated. Yes. And in the second will, the forged one, you were granted primary control over Elaine Carter's estate. Correct? He looked down. Yes. And who drafted that document? I did. Did you inform Franklin Carter that the original will existed? No. Did you tell anyone about it? No. Why not? A long pause. Because I didn't think it mattered. Angela tilted her head. You didn't think it mattered that your daughter's inheritance was being erased? No response. And then she leaned in for the kill. Mr. Carter, do you understand that what you did was not just a violation of legal ethics, but an attempt to annihilate your own family on paper? He stared at her. For once, completely still, and then, almost imperceptibly, he looked at me. I didn't blink, because I wasn't looking at my ex-husband anymore. I was looking at a man stripped of all his shadows. The deposition ended. Daniel and his lawyer left quickly. Angela gathered her notes without comment. But before she packed up, she looked at me and said, that wasn't just a confession. That was strategy collapse. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was Franklin. He looked like hell, unshaven, shoulders slumped, holding a brown folder. I'm not here to fight, he said. I stepped aside, cautiously. Then why are you here? To give you this. Inside the folder was a stack of letters, emails, notes, receipts, all showing Franklin's full communications with Daniel during the estate filing. Some made Franklin look complicit. But others? Others showed his confusion. His hesitation. He was turning over everything. Why now? I asked. He rubbed his hands together. Because I have a daughter too. And I don't want her growing up thinking I protected a liar. I nodded once. This was an absolution, but it was a step. Angela called later that day. We're filing the motion to finalize recognition of the original will. With Franklin cooperating, it's practically guaranteed. She paused. And the fraud charges? They're sticking. The war was almost over, but Daniel's final reckoning hadn't yet begun. Daniel's bar suspension came through 2 weeks later. It was swift. Brutal. Public. A formal notice appeared on the Oregon State Bar website. Daniel Carter, license suspended pending further disciplinary review related to misconduct, fraud, and falsification of legal documentation. Angela forwarded me the link. I stared at it for a long time. Not out of satisfaction, but out of something closer to quiet disbelief. He was falling. Not loudly. Not violently, just, inevitably. That same week, the judge signed the final motion. The May will was validated, binding, and legally enforceable. Emily's trust was restored. The fake will was officially invalidated, stricken from record. With language as sharp as it was final, found to be forged with intent to defraud. All related filings are considered null and void. I read that line again. Then again. Daniel's version of reality, erased. The irony wasn't lost on me. Angela called to walk me through the implications. With the will reinstated and the fraud documented, you'll be entitled to pursue punitive damages in addition to inheritance. We can push further if you're willing. But I wanted more than money. I wanted record that we filed to attach the court findings to a public fraud database used by banks and institutions, a move that would haunt Daniel's professional reputation for years to come. Angela warned me, it's not personal. It's procedural. I said, it's both. That afternoon, I took Emily to the park. It was a strange day, sunny but cold. She ran toward the swings, laughing, light. She didn't know the storm had passed, but I did. I watched her toes scrape the clouds as she soared higher. Free MY phone buzzed. Another email is subject, Carter vs. Carter, fraud case update. Daniel's legal team had sent a formal notice. They were withdrawing from his representation due to irreconcilable breakdown in cooperation. He was out of money, out of allies, out of spin. Angela texted one word, checkmate. I didn't reply that night. I pulled down the attic ladder one last time. I climbed slowly, the old wood groaning under my weight. The attic hadn't changed, the same musty air, the same forgotten boxes. But I wasn't the same woman who'd stood here weeks ago, trembling in the dark, holding an envelope she didn't understand. I found the cedar chest. Sat beside it. Touched the lid. Elaine had known. Not everything, but enough. She hadn't trusted Daniel. She hadn't trusted the system. But she trusted me, just enough to leave a breadcrumb in a box of moth-eaten quilts. I whispered, thank you. Then I closed the chest and stood. No ghosts here anymore, just truth, finally unearthed. Back downstairs, I tucked Emily into bed. She blinked sleepily and whispered, Mom, are we safe now? I nodded, yes, baby. We are. The next morning, Daniel sent one last message. A single sentence, I never thought you had it in you. I didn't respond. What he thought no longer mattered. He thought silence meant surrender. He thought gentleness meant weakness. He thought erasing me would be easy, but some women don't disappear, they return, and they rewrite everything. Daniel didn't show up for the next court appearance. His new attorney, a weary-looking man from a low-rent firm across the river, appeared on his behalf and requested a continuance, citing Daniel's fragile mental state. The judge gave them 5 business days. No more. Angela turned to me as we exited the courtroom. He's stalling. I know, I said. But he's running out of runway. And he was, with his bar suspension public and the estate formally stripped from his control. Daniel had no standing left to hide behind. The fraud case was still pending, but the weight of civil and professional consequences had already collapsed him from the inside. Angela filed an injunction to freeze what little remained of his assets. Daniel had already liquidated most of his accounts in the weeks before our first hearing, but he hadn't expected a full forensic sweep of his property records. Turns out he'd quietly transferred the title of his car and personal cabin to a friend's name. We subpoenaed the friend. He flipped in one phone call. Angela submitted the findings under the Uniform Fraudulent Transfers Act. The court ordered both properties frozen and flagged for potential seizure. Daniel, who once walked like he owned every room, was now legally shackled, but the part that surprised me wasn't how fast it fell apart, it was how easy it was for him to lie until it didn't work. He hadn't stumbled. He hadn't panicked. He'd calmly, almost methodically, built a paper trail meant to bury me, and if I hadn't found that will in the attic, I might still be legally dead, Emily, and I might still be erased from her grandmother's legacy. I told Angela I wanted one final action, a letter to the local community paper. Not dramatic. Not scandalous. Just a statement, calm, legal, public, that clarified the truth and closed the narrative. She agreed that we drafted it together. To whom it may concern, in May of this year, my name, Madeline Carter, was falsely declared deceased as part of an effort to remove me and my daughter from a rightful inheritance. After a full legal process, the original will was restored, and the fraudulent documents invalidated. I remained silent during the process to allow facts and law to do their work. But now that the matter is near its end, I wish to say this: I was never gone. I was simply underestimated. Madeline Carter. We published it the next Sunday. It didn't go viral. It didn't explode, but it did exactly what I needed it to. It ended the story, on my terms. That Monday, I walked into Emily's school for parent-teacher conferences. Her teacher, Mrs. Langley, looked up from her notes and smiled. You must be so proud of her. I am, I said. More than she knows. She's been drawing a lot lately, Mrs. Langley said. Big houses. Castles. Lots of strong walls. She said, it's a safe place for me and Mommy. I nodded, holding back the sting behind my eyes. After the meeting, we walked to the car under orange September leaves. Emily held my hand, skipping as she hummed to herself. Daniel used to joke that I was too quiet to win. That I'd never survive outside his shadow, but shadows only exist when there's light, and I had finally found mine. Angela called later that evening. Daniel's team just sent a notice. He's not contesting the fraud suit anymore. They're offering to settle the full damages, plus legal fees, in exchange for no criminal referral. And what happens if we decline? Then the state pursues charges, and he risks jail time. I thought about it long and hard, but when I looked at Emily, playing in the living room floor, safe and bright, I realized something. I didn't need vengeance, I just needed completion. Settle it, I said. Let him live in the world he tried to erase me from, knowing he failed. Angela paused. You're the coldest kind of powerful, you know that? I learned from the best, I replied. The settlement came through in the third week of October. $385,000 wired into a new trust account under Emily's name. An additional $40,000 paid to cover my legal fees, and one line at the bottom of the agreement that made everything sit just a little bit deeper in the bones. This resolution acknowledges no wrongdoing by the plaintiff, Madeline Carter, and affirms her legal and familial standing as both spouse and direct beneficiary under the original will of Elaine Carter. That sentence didn't carry monetary value, but it was everything, because words had been the weapon Daniel wielded from the beginning. He tried to write me out from documents, from memory, from legacy. And now, with his own signature, he was forced to restore me. Angela and I reviewed the paperwork in her office that afternoon. She didn't smile when we hit submit. She just exhaled slowly and said, that's the end of his leverage. But I wasn't smiling either, because I knew something she didn't. This wasn't the end, not really. The court proceedings were over. The money was secured. The truth had survived. But I still had one final piece left of closure, not for Daniel, for me. I hadn't returned to Elaine's grave since the funeral I was never invited to. I didn't go out of bitterness. I stayed away because at the time, I still believed Daniel's distance was grief, not strategy. I'd given him space. Given him silence, given him room to act alone. So the next morning, I drove to the cemetery alone. I brought a single white lily. Elaine hated roses. Thought they were vain little things. She'd said that once, while pruning a row of them in her garden with a scowl on her face. I hadn't laughed at the time. But now, it made me smile. Her grave was simple: Elaine Carter, beloved mother and friend, 1949-2025. No mention of me. No survived by. Just a carefully controlled legacy. I knelt down, placed the flower on the stone, and spoke aloud. You saw something coming, didn't you? Maybe not the whole thing, but enough to leave me that envelope. And I don't know if you ever really liked me, but I think, maybe you respected me. I paused, fingers brushing the cool edge of the marker. I found it. The will. The truth. I protected your granddaughter. And I stayed standing. The wind picked up gently, moving the trees just enough to sound like a sigh. I stood, nodded once, and turned back toward the path behind me. The gravestone stayed unchanged. But something in me shifted, not relief, not satisfaction, just release. Daniel had taken his shot. He had tried to write a future where I didn't exist. And I'd rewritten it with truth. That afternoon, I met Emily at school. She ran into my arms, giggling, her backpack bouncing against her back. Can we get ice cream? She asked. Only if you promise to share, I said. She grinned. No promises. We drove with the windows down, the radio low, the October sun warming the backs of our hands. No more lawyers, no more motions, no more secrets in the attic. Angela called one final time that week. We're closing the file, she said. Unless he violates the settlement, it's done. I told her thank you. I meant it. Then I deleted Daniel's number from my phone. Not blocked. Not saved, just gone. He no longer existed in any space I lived in. Emily and I started over. New locks. New rhythms. New boundaries, and every night. Before she fell asleep, she asked the same question, are we okay, now? And every night, I gave her the same answer. Yes, baby. We are. Because we were, and because I would never again let anyone make me doubt that. I thought silence would feel like peace. Instead, it felt like space, space to breathe, space to think, space to feel everything I had pushed aside while building my war. I was no longer in survival mode. The court battles were over. The accounts were settled. The inheritance was secured. The fraudulent will burn to ash, legally speaking, but what do you do when the fight ends and you're still standing? You rebuild. That fall, I started painting again. Nothing grand, just watercolors at the kitchen table while Emily worked on homework beside me. She liked to narrate her math problems like they were detective stories. I liked to listen. It felt like the air was finally still. One evening, she asked, can we paint the attic? I looked up from my brush. Why the attic? That's where you saved us. It stopped me cold. She hadn't been told everything, just that Daddy had made a big mistake and that Mommy fixed it. But she had pieced more together than I realized. We don't need to paint it, I said. It already told the truth. She seemed satisfied with that. I wasn't naive. I knew Daniel's name might still come up someday. At school. At a birthday party. Maybe years from now, when Emily was older and started asking the sharper questions, and I'd be ready, not with venom, with evidence. With clarity. Angela once told me, most people think strength is yelling louder. It's not. Strength is knowing what to say when you could have said everything, and choosing precision instead. So I chose quiet moves. I rewrote my will. Appointed a neutral guardian for Emily in the event of anything happening to me. Put every single financial document in her name in a locked safe with a handwritten letter beside it, just in case someone ever tried to erase us again. I updated my name legally. Dropped Carter. I didn't return to my maiden name either. I chose something new, Madeline Gray, the color between black and white. The space where clarity lives. The name fit. I reconnected with Monica. We met for coffee downtown, both of us wearing wool scarves and trading stories about work. She looked at me over her cappuccino and said, you've changed. Better or worse? Sharper, she said. Like a woman who knows her edges now. That stuck with me, knowing your edges, where you end, where others begin. Daniel had blurred those lines for years. Gaslighted me with charm. Weaponized silence. Used legality like a cage, but now my boundaries weren't invisible anymore. I enrolled Emily in an after-school program. Took a part-time consulting job with a local hospice clinic. Nothing intense. Just enough to feel useful again. To remind myself that I had skills beyond survival. The biggest surprise came in December. A letter, handwritten. No return address, inside, a single sheet of paper. Short. Unsigned. But the handwriting was familiar. Daniel, I should have known better. You were never weak. You were just watching. I lost everything trying to bury a woman who already knew how to resurrect herself. Don't respond. I just needed to say it once. I read it twice, then I fed it to the fire. Not out of anger, out of certainty, because that letter wasn't for closure. It was for his conscience. And I owed him nothing. Emily and I spent Christmas together in pajamas. Just us. Cinnamon rolls. A cheap plastic tree. Laughter echoing down a hallway that used to feel hollow. Now it felt full, and not because we had money, not because we won in court, but because we were no longer living inside someone else's version of our lives. That we had rewritten everything. Winter melted into spring, and for the first time in what felt like forever, my calendar didn't revolve around court dates, discovery deadlines, or waiting for legal motions to drop like bombs. There was no more Daniel, not legally. Not financially. Not spiritually, but the funny thing about surviving something like that is, you don't just go back to who you were before. You rebuild as someone else, someone who remembers every silence. Every threat wrapped in kindness, every document that almost wiped you from your own story. One morning, as I stood folding laundry, I found a tiny drawing tucked into the pocket of Emily's jeans. A house. A little stick figure mom. And a box in the attic with a heart on it. I felt it like a small, clean cut. She remembered, even at 7, she knew that something hidden in that attic had saved us. Not money. Not magic. Just a single decision, to stop trusting silence and start asking for truth. Angela called that week with one last update. The final fraud summary is now public record, she said. Bar license officially revoked. The Oregon fraud database has flagged him for 10 years. No banks. No practice. No fiduciary roles. He's done. Buried by his own pen, she said. Poetic. I didn't ask what happened to him after that. I didn't care if he moved or remarried or reinvented himself in another state. The only version of him I needed to remember was the one I survived and dismantled. I focused on building instead. Emily and I started a garden. Not much, just a few raised beds behind the house with basil, cherry tomatoes, and snap peas. It gave us something to do with our hands, something simple. Something alive. One afternoon, she knelt in the dirt and said, "Mom, what if someone tries to steal our garden?" I smiled, pulling my gloves off. They can try, I said. But we know where the roots are now. She grinned, satisfied with that. Later that evening, as she fell asleep with her arms wrapped around the dog-eared copy of Charlotte's Web, I sat in the hallway outside her room, the light dim, the house quiet. So I pulled out a notebook I hadn't touched in months, the same one I'd used to keep records during the case. At the top of a blank page, I wrote, "What they didn't know," and below that, "I was always watching. I kept everything. I learned faster than they expected. I wasn't afraid to disappear. But I knew how to come back louder. I never needed revenge. I only needed record." I closed the notebook. That was the final entry. A month later, I received a package in the mail. No return address. Inside, a black fountain pen. The kind Daniel used to sign all his official documents. No note. No explanation. I threw it away, not because I was angry, because I didn't need a symbol from a man who used symbols as weapons. I already had my OWNMY named My Daughter My Truth. The attic was cleaned out that spring. I didn't keep the chest. I didn't hold on to the will. It was filed where it belonged, protected by law, not memory. We reclaimed that space, painted it soft blue. Turned it into Emily's reading nook. She called it her sky room. A place for her imagination. A place without secrets, And when she asked if we could paint clouds on the ceiling, I said yes, because now, we lived under open skies, spring turned to summer, and in our little house at the edge of town, peace became a routine, not a novelty. And oh, more court hearings. No more legal drafts cluttering my kitchen table. No more wondering who still believed Daniel's version of the truth. The story had been told. Not just in filings and courtroom testimonies, but in the subtle shift of how people looked at me in the grocery store, or spoke to me at Emily's school pickup. They didn't see the quiet wife anymore, they saw the woman who came back from the dead, and took her name with her. One morning, a woman I barely knew, an acquaintance from the PTA, the kind of woman who never made eye contact before, stopped me in the school parking lot. "You're Madeline Gray, right?" I hesitated. Yes. I just wanted to say, thank you. For what? For not disappearing. I nodded. That was all I gave her. She didn't need the full story. She already knew enough. That was the thing about truth, it echoes. Angela and I stayed in touch. She'd become more than my attorney, she was a compass. She never told me what to feel, only how to protect what I'd built. One day, over lunch, she said, "You could do this, you know." Do what? Help other women. Legal consulting. Advocacy. You have a story that cuts through the noise. I laughed. I'm a hospice nurse, not a crusader. You're both, she said. You're proof that silence isn't the same as surrender. I didn't commit to anything that day. But the seed was planted. Weeks later, I opened a small website, anonymous at first. A place for women to write in and ask questions about inheritance rights, custody traps, document manipulation. I didn't give legal advice, just direction. Language. Steps, and the emails poured in, some heartbreaking. Some infuriating. But all of them familiar. Women erased from estates. Manipulated into signing away power. Told they were overreacting when paperwork didn't match their instincts. I answered everyone. IT became a ritual. After Emily went to sleep, I'd pour tea, open the inbox, and write back as MG, calmly, methodically, like Angela had done for me. And one night, I read an email that stopped me cold. It was from a woman in Montana. Her name was Rachel. Her husband had filed a separation agreement with forged financials and claimed she abandoned the marriage. He'd listed her as unreachable. She found out through a credit report. Her last line read, "I feel like a ghost." I stared at the words, heart pounding. I could see her. Not literally, but emotionally. Sitting in a quiet house, forgotten. Erased by someone who knew just enough about the law to use it like a scalpel. I wrote back, "You're not a ghost. You're a witness. And witnesses don't disappear, they testify. Let's start with where your name is missing." 3 weeks later, she wrote again that she'd found the original prenup, that she'd hired an attorney, she had taken her first breath of air in months, and I realized then, Daniel hadn't just tried to erase me, yet he'd trained me, taught me how they hide things. How they weaponize systems. How they expect silence to mean permission, and now, I was teaching others how to rise from the paper grave, not in anger, in precision. Emily turned 8 that summer. We threw a small party in the backyard, bubbles, chocolate cake, folding chairs, the dog stealing snacks under the table. She looked happy. Whole, not like the daughter of a war, but like the child of a woman who didn't back down. As the sun set, I watched her chase fireflies, her laughter echoing off the fence, and in that moment, I knew, the attic didn't just hold a will. It held a turning point, the moment I chose truth over survival, and from that, a life was rebuilt. When the first journalist reached out, I almost ignored it. The email sat unopened in my inbox for 3 days. The subject line read, "Request for interview, Oregon inheritance fraud story." I didn't want the noise. Not the media circus. Not the headlines, but I also knew that stories like mine only made a difference if they were told clearly, and told by the person who lived them. So, on the 4th day, I opened the email. The journalist's name was Claire Holbrook, an investigative reporter for a mid-sized regional paper. Her writing was clean, respectful. She included links to her past work, one of which detailed a woman's fight against a forged guardianship case involving her father's estate. Claire wasn't a tabloid chaser. She was deliberate. Still, I didn't respond right away. That night, I sat with Emily in her reading nook, the old attic, now painted soft blue and filled with beanbags and shelves of chapter books. She had fallen asleep with a flashlight tucked under her chin, open to a worn copy of The Secret Garden, and I thought, this is what I protected, not money, not reputation, just this stillness, this space, this right to exist freely and fully without the shadows someone else tried to cast over us. So the next morning, I emailed Claire back that we met for coffee. Public. Neutral ground. She didn't ask invasive questions. She let me speak. And when I finished recounting the timeline, the documents, the discovery of the original will in the attic, she simply said, "You do know this is bigger than one man, right?" I nodded. Then why didn't you speak sooner? I sipped my tea, because truth is a weapon. And you don't draw it until the moment it matters most. The article ran 2 weeks later. The headline was clean: she was declared dead. She showed up in court. It didn't go viral. It wasn't clickbait, but the right people read it: lawyers, judges, women's advocacy groups. It began circulating in quiet circles, in divorce forums, estate dispute webinars, legal aid centers. My inbox began to shift. Not just stories now, but questions. How do I check if a new will was filed behind my back? Can someone legally name me missing in another state? What do I do if my husband's attorney won't return my calls about my father-in-law's trust? I didn't pretend to have all the answers, but I knew where to point them. Angela and I co-authored a short guide, When They Try to Erase You, A Quiet Woman's Handbook. It was free. PDF. No names. No logos. We included sample affidavits, legal terms to Google, a checklist of red flags in estate and trust paperwork. The subtitle? Survival is not surrender. Knowledge is not noise. We distributed it anonymously. By spring, it had been downloaded over 40,000 times. Daniel never spoke publicly. His law license was revoked permanently. He moved, someone said, to Idaho. Someone else said he was working in construction under a different name. It didn't matter, because ghosts don't haunt the living, they haunt the guilty, and Daniel would live with the one thing he couldn't bury, the truth. The final nail came not from me, but from the judge. A statement entered into public record during the last fraud hearing. This court finds that Madeline Carter acted with extraordinary diligence and courage in the face of a highly coordinated attempt to strip her of legal identity and rightful inheritance. Her testimony and evidence not only protected her child, but exposed systemic loopholes that demand future scrutiny. That line was more than vindication. It was precedent. Angela framed it for me. Hung it just inside my front door. Not as decoration, as armor, for the days when I still doubted. When I wondered if the old version of me, the too-patient wife, the quiet nurse, the woman who let paperwork speak louder than instincts, might return. She won't, because that woman died the moment I was declared dead, and the one who returned, she doesn't vanish. She writes, she records, she never signs anything she hasn't read twice. The guide Angela and I wrote took on a life of its own. Within a few months, legal clinics in 5 different states were referencing it during intake consultations. A small nonprofit in Colorado asked permission to print it out for distribution at shelters and family resource centers. They didn't know it was me behind it, only that AM.G stood for someone who understood, and that was all I needed. Them to note I wasn't trying to become a symbol. I was trying to make sure no one else got quietly erased because someone in a suit knew how to file a form faster than they could find a lawyer. One night in June, I got an email from a paralegal named James in Oregon City. He worked at a mid-tier estate planning firm, and he'd read Claire Holbrook's article. He said one of his clients, an older widow, had been pressured by her adult stepson to rewrite her will. James suspected foul play, but didn't know what steps to take. The firm didn't want to get involved. He wrote, "Your story helped me realize I have a responsibility to act, even if I'm not the lead attorney. What you did gave the rest of us permission to stop pretending bad things are rare." I stared at that sentence for a long time. Permission to stop pretending that's what Daniel had stolen from me all those years. The right to say something was off, and to be taken seriously. He wore his lies like cufflinks, polished, professional, almost charming. The kind of man who could smile while suffocating you on paper, but now? I had become the paper, and every woman who read our guide was one more set of eyes that couldn't be closed again. Angela and I started doing quiet pro bono consultations. Just once a week. We called it Document Dignity. No office. No branding. Just legal triage for women being erased by bad actors using legal tools. IT was slow. Careful. Intentional, because the women who came to us weren't looking for saviors. They were looking for proof they weren't crazy, and I knew exactly what that felt like. One case hit me hard. A young mom, recently widowed. Her late husband's brother had filed for guardianship of her son's inheritance, claiming she was mentally unstable due to grief. She didn't know how to fight. The paperwork overwhelmed her. Her name was disappearing from her own child's financial future. We walked her through every step. She filed an objection. She won. She wrote me a letter that ended with one line I'll never forget: "Thank you for standing up so I could stop falling down." Some days, I still caught myself looking over my shoulder. Not for Daniel, for the feeling of him. The manipulation. The calm voice masking chaos. The casual way he'd twist silence into consent, but that version of me, the one who let it happen, she was gone. She'd been buried with that forged will, and the woman who stood in her place now kept files. Backups. Receipts. Emily was thriving. She'd started writing stories. At bedtime, she'd crawl under the covers with a pink notebook and scribble out adventures about warrior girls, magical forests, and tiny kingdoms hidden in flower pots. One night, she asked, "Mom, are stories always true?" "Not always," I said. "But sometimes they become true when we tell them." She nodded like she understood. "Then I'm going to write one where the girl finds a key in the attic and it saves everyone." I smiled. "I think that's already been written." She blinked. "By who?" "By you," I whispered, because it was her future I fought for, not vengeance. Not reputation. Just the right for a little girl to grow up with her name intact, her legacy protected, and the truth never folded into a drawer. Daniel never resurfaced. His silence wasn't peace, it was consequence. And mine? Mine was power. The summer Emily turned 9, we took a road trip up the coast, just the two of us, one suitcase, a bag of snacks, her sketchpad, and a playlist we built together called Warrior Songs. It wasn't about escape. It was about motion. About proving to ourselves that the road ahead was no longer filled with hidden traps or legal shadows. Somewhere outside Newport, we pulled off the highway to walk a cliff trail overlooking the Pacific. She climbed the rocks ahead of me, hair whipping in the salt wind, arms wide like wings. She turned back and yelled, "You're slow, Mom." I grinned. "I'm calculating my next move." She laughed, then disappeared around the bend. That was the first time I realized I hadn't thought about Daniel in days. Not his voice. Not his smirk. Not the tone he used when explaining how these things just happen, like fraud was a thunderstorm. He wasn't behind me anymore. He was buried under every lie he thought would outlast me. Back home, the emails kept coming. Quiet messages from strangers who'd found our guide, read the article, or simply stumbled across the words, "declared legally dead," and clicked out of disbelief. Some wanted help, some wanted justice, some just wanted someone to tell them they weren't insane. One woman, Sarah, wrote about a will that was rewritten while her mother was sedated in hospice. She had no proof, only suspicions. I didn't give her false hope. I gave her language. The words to ask the right questions. The phrases to use when speaking to a probate lawyer. A month later, she wrote back. She'd found the original will in an old envelope her mother had hidden inside a shoebox. I told her to keep it safe, not just the paper, the knowing. That moment when your gut aligns with evidence and your story shifts from victim to strategist. Angela joked once, "You're building a whole army of attic women." I liked that, women who'd been pushed into corners. Women who were told they didn't understand money, or law, or documents. Women who stopped accepting confusion as control. Emily started asking more questions, too, about legacy, about names, about what it meant to fight smart. One night, after brushing her teeth, she stood in the hallway and asked, "Was Daddy ever proud of me?" The question hit harder than any subpoena. I sat down on the floor and motioned for her to join me. I think he didn't know how to be proud, I said. Not the way you deserved. She looked down. I remember him being nice. Then mean. That's not your fault. I know, she said. And just like that, she closed the book on that chapter, because Emily was learning young what took me too long to understand. When someone tries to control the story, it's not because they're powerful. It's because they're afraid of what you'll say when you finally speak up. By fall, we had a routine: work, school, garden, emails. Rest. No more tension in the walls. No more checking the mail like it might contain a weapon. Just breath. One morning, as I locked the front door, I noticed the plaque Angela had framed was tilting slightly. I straightened it, acted with extraordinary diligence and courage in the face of a highly coordinated attempt to strip her of legal identity and rightful inheritance. I touched it once, then turned the key. The woman who was declared dead was no longer here. In her place stood someone sharper, stronger, unforgettable. That a year to the day after I found the envelope in the attic, I returned to that space, not as a woman searching for proof, but as a woman choosing how her story would close. The attic was clean now. The old cedar chest was gone, donated to a shelter that furnished transitional housing. Emily's reading nook had expanded into a full-blown art corner: easel, bookshelves, stacks of paper, jars of glitter, and a stubborn beanbag she insisted was part of the process. I climbed the steps alone, a quiet mug of tea in hand. The late autumn sun bled through the tiny window, painting long gold lines across the floor. I stood in the same spot I'd stood when I first cracked that envelope open, where Elaine's simple sentence had changed everything: keep this safe, in case they try anything. She hadn't left me a weapon. She'd left me warning, and I had turned it into war. I pulled a small folder from the shelf. Inside were copies, certified, notarized, redundantly backed up, of every key document. From the case, the original will, the subpoenaed financials, the death certificate, the court's fraud ruling, Claire's article, our guide, the evidence of everything they tried, and everything I undid. I didn't review them for nostalgia. I reviewed them because I knew the world doesn't just change when truth is revealed. It changes when truth is remembered, because women like me aren't erased in a single blow. We're erased in whispers, in overlooked details, in assumptions that were too tired, too busy, too trusting to question the signatures. But I had questioned them, and now I had answers. I closed the folder, labeled it in Emily's handwriting. Mom's proof. She didn't know what that meant yet. But one day, she'd inherit more than trust funds and court transcripts, but she'd inherit strategy. Angela retired the following spring. She left me her Rolodex of contacts and a note that read, "Don't stop teaching the quiet ones how to speak." I didn't. We formalized the work, created a small legal referral network, hired a paralegal, registered Document Dignity as a nonprofit. Not because I wanted recognition, but because women deserved more than whispers in the dark. Emily, now 10, started calling me a lawyer without the suit. I liked that we framed her first drawing from the reading nook, a stick figure girl standing in front of a house with a big padlock on the door and a heart floating above the roof. At the bottom, in crooked pink letters, she'd written, "No one disappears here." Exactly right. One evening, she came into the kitchen holding an old photo she'd found tucked in a drawer. It was me and Daniel. Before it all, she held it up. "This him?" I nodded. She stared for a second, then turned the photo over and said, "He looks different in my head." "How so?" "Smaller." That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room, not grieving, just still, because I had learned the rarest kind of peace, the kind that comes not from being rescued, but from resurrecting yourself and knowing that no one will ever bury you again. I was declared dead. On paper, in rooms I was never invited to, in documents signed by a man who knew I wouldn't fight back fast enough, but I wasn't dead. I was watching, while they moved numbers between accounts and smiled at funerals. I stood in silence, measured, unfolding. And when I finally moved, I didn't scream. I filed. When I hit with evidence and no vengeance. Just correction, the kind that sticks. I didn't come back to make noise. I came back to make record. Because that's what they really fear, the permanence of paper in the hands of someone they underestimated. Daniel's legacy is sealed now, not by what he stole, but by what I recovered. He will live in whispers of revoked licenses and quiet refusals. He will sit at tables where no one quite trusts him. Because somewhere out there, the woman he declared dead showed up with the truth, and she didn't flinch. I didn't need the final word, I just needed the right one. And now that it's written, I can disappear by choice, not because I was erased, but because I've been heard. This story is over, but the next woman's won't be. Not if she finds her attic. Not if she reads this, not if she knows that somewhere, a quiet girl came back to life and rewrote everything. Cold, clean truth. They signed my death, I filed their ending.